This is the map. This is the map of release, and this is the map of meditation. If we do that, and if we're very devoted to this, then all the defilements, all the impurities of the mind starts to break apart and break down, and we start to see reality like this, just the seen as the seen, the cognized as the cognized, the perceived as the perceived. We don't label, we don't put our opinions and preferences, ideas, judgments about the experience. We just live completely at peace with whatever is. But we can't just say that and feel that. It's a mental training, because we're hardwired to feel the opposite. Like it's proven, we have a negativity bias. So we have to overcome this, and this is what we're doing here.
I'm leaving home for the coastline, someplace under the sun. I feel my heart for the first time.
Good smiles. It's making me laugh. Good. It's like all this positive blast coming at me. It's like hard to not be happy. Ayyo. Okay. So, good evening. So tonight, I have a little special for you tonight. And we will begin by listening to a little story. I think this story that is narrated or offered by Dr. Jill Bolte Tailor about her stroke of insight, which we will be watching tonight. It lasts for maybe 15-20 minutes. The audio-visual facilities here are, this is kind of a learning curve, and this is a new place, so it's going to probably get homey for a little bit, because we're going to just watch it out of this computer screen. So probably everybody will have to kind of come snudge a little closer. I really enjoy the way that she's talking. Well, it's not really, I don't know if it's enjoyable or not, but how she's explaining the six senses. How when the first thing that she felt when she was this great big whale in this ocean of, what does she say? Of energy, of just like calm, peace, and just gliding in there. And when she came back to her body, all the six senses were so intense. And I think this is a little bit what the Buddha is talking about when he's talking about the sense, we call them the sense pleasures, but just the six senses. I think the more we practice the release from this, the release of the mind, this is kind of one of the insights that come is, wow, sensory engagement is quite something. Yes, so becoming a child again. Yes. Sorry? It's inspiring, yes, yes. So becoming a child again and talking about the schooling system, how it basically prioritizes the left hemisphere of our brains, and then we end up with chatterboxes. And this is something that is so confining when we don't really notice it until we actually break out of it for a moment. Sometimes because it's so deeply ingrained within our mental training, as you mentioned, the schooling system. This is how we learn to perceive and function in this world. But in reality, that doesn't mean that's really for our own benefit. And I think a lot of people nowadays are looking for a way out of that. Either, with a lot of different ways. Isn't that interesting also how she's basically, when she's comparing the two, it seems like one of them is about focusing and the other one is about completely being just an open awareness of everything in the background. So that's really, and it's something as we practice with this, with the 6 R's, with releasing, relaxing our attention from these thoughts, from the storyline, is what we are tapping into more and more and more and more and more. And really, after some time practicing like this, we really notice when the mind starts to zoom in on things and grab, and really, it's something that you can actually see, like it's like a focal kind of lens that kind of shuts in. And when you get used to kind of a broader kind of open field of awareness that is kind of welcoming, that is just at peace and welcoming and not judging, you can totally see when the mind starts to really narrow down onto a specific thing or a story or a thought. Mm-hmm. Yes. And it seems like one of the hemisphere is actually quite wholesome. It is quite all-inclusive and compassionate, and in other words, she says, we're all beautiful and we're all a family and there's no problem, basically. There's just like this all-inclusive space. And then there's that other part where, we become separate. We become individuals on our own ways. But yeah, there's this kind of broad awareness, perhaps, is that what you were saying, where everything is just felt the way that it is, sensed the way that it is, seen the way that it is.
I do feel that it's still a necessary science. Both have to be
Yes, both sides have to be balanced. And awakened beings are not just cutting off a portion of their brain out. Surely not. I think what is interesting about the story was perhaps to help us give a different perspective on that imbalance that we all seem to have to some extent. I mean, I'm nobody that escaped that in my own ways. I can't remember if I mentioned it in this retreat, but when I did practice these sweat lodge ceremonies in Mexico and in Eastern Canada, my mind went beyond thinking because it had to break free from it. In the heat, just thinking was like hell. It was like living in hell. It was crazy. It was just so painful. just thinking, having a little thought. And so you couldn't have any. It was just like either you let it go or you're just like suffering, like really. That's the time I would use the word suffering because it's so hot. It's so hot, and you can't even keep your composure, and so you have to get rid of it. And then mind kind of became very clear and very bright, and without any thought, and everything becomes very intuitive, very like. That was a time where I was digging into a lot of traditions of the heart, basically opening up the heart and like living from the heart all the time with less of our left hemisphere active and just going towards more intuition than logical thought. But again, these techniques or these practices are not necessarily complete because I still need to make a fire and heat up like 60 rocks, which takes me like 4 hours or 5 hours, takes me a whole day. And in the end, it's not necessarily through wisdom. It helps, it does help. It did help me on my path, but so I think the talk of obviously is not, completely in line with Buddhism. Obviously, this is not the same kind of nirvana that we're talking about. And this is one of the most common misunderstandings out there about what is nirvana. It's like, well, it's a rock band. But nirvana, in Buddhism, it's when we really understand the teachings of the Buddha, Nibbāna is specific ideas. There's a few specific ideas about it that are quite essential. And if we start believing that any experience, that blissful experience that we have is Nibbāna, then it's not necessarily what we mean here.
It's not devoid of wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
By seeing states like that.
I think it's basically just cleansing the left hemisphere from unwholesome states, basically unwholesome karma, unwholesome sankharas, basically, because that's what that word means, is like these mental conditionings, sankharas. So I like the whale gliding in the ocean of quiet and peace and euphoria, this silent euphoria. And the more you practice, if you wish to practice metta and bring metta further, there are ways, because now we're starting to kind of move further in the practice, and some people are moving away from the metta to a deeper released kind of state. But when you practice metta continuously, if you want to take metta further, for example, then I think that's pretty much how it feels. Just all the time, your life becomes like you're just this giant, peaceful whale gliding in an ocean of silent euphoria. That's the Brahma Vihara. And then I think it's such a beautiful, and she doesn't even know about what we're talking about, but it's so connected in so many ways. This Brahma Vihara's way of abiding of Brahma. There's no, it's all vastness, bliss, love. And on this topic of nirvana, what is this nirvana? And I thought I would offer a small section of a sutta which goes through the levels of meditation and explains to us in the Buddha's wisdom how to experience a lot of this, but in a purely wholesome mental development kind of way. Because this is actually not reserved for people who have strokes And like she says, you can just decide to step aside from your left hemisphere. Or basically, I think that also means, because that her experience is quite extreme, she's had a radical shift in her perspective, and she can kind of tap into that. But usually that's not necessarily how we can do it. We need a kind of a path. We need a gradual training to get there. And this is what I'd like to offer for this second part of the discourse. And this is found in the long discourses, number 9, Poṭṭhapāda Sutta, where the Buddha explains the gradual release of the mind and how to enter Nibbāna, basically. How to actually enter the space that we call Nirodha samāpatti. Hopefully we'll be able to end with the end of, this is a very long sutta because it's in the long discourses, the collection. So I'm only selecting a couple of very short passages. And so since we are already quite advanced in the evening, I'll make it even shorter so that we've already talked about the 4 first levels of meditation, the first 4 jhanas in, I believe it was on day 3 or something like that. And so I'll just go fairly quickly over them and then go into the arupa jhanas to explain a little bit what happens to the mind when the mind is starting to be uplifted enough that it kind of takes off. Remember the simile of the hot air balloon? Now the balloon is up, and now it's dropping its little weights on the sides, and it's ready to lift and become very light, basically. And so this wanderer, this spiritual wanderer, like it was the custom at the time of the Buddha, his name was Poṭṭhapāda, and he was curious about how this complete cessation from perceptual awareness happens. And this is a kind of an interesting question because the Buddha pretty much came up with this understanding that there was a place where you could enter, or there was a state that could be experienced which was a complete release, complete cessation from perceptual awareness, and basically also consciousness, experience, which is not death and is actually quite blissful. So experiencing the gradual disappearance of these 5 hindrances, now you'll be familiar with that. Within oneself, relief arises. Because of that relief comes joy. With an uplifted mind, the body calms down. With a calm body, one experiences happiness, and the happy mind becomes collected. So of course I'm skipping everything that was before that, where he's talking about how to develop the virtues, how to guard the sense faculties. This is for another talk, but let's go right into the meditation here. So having these 7 supports of awakening arising through right effort, then disengaged from the senses and detached from unwholesome mental states, still attended by thinking and reflection, with the blissful happiness born of mental detachment, one experiences and abides in the first level of meditation, and this is with loving kindness. So basically at this point, we simply 6R, hold the metta, and these are the wholesome states. By 6Ring, releasing and relaxing, the unwholesome states that could be found in the mind starts to drop, like the weights on the hot air balloon, and then there's this joy that comes from letting go of the senses and any kind of agitation from outside. The sense perceptions that one previously had fade away. So engaging in the senses, the sensory perceptions, now this fades away. At that time, there is a true and yet subtle perception of joy and happiness that comes from letting go. At that time, one perceives this true and yet subtle joy and happiness that comes from letting go. In this way, some perceptions arise by practice, and some perceptions are given up by practice. And this is that practice. Then Poṭṭhapāda, with the calming of thinking and reflection, with inner tranquilization, one's mind becoming unified, without thinking and reflection. With the blissful happiness born of mental stillness, one experiences and abides in the second level of meditation. This is still with the metta. And see here, the thinking and reflection calms down quite a lot, and the mind starts to become unified a little bit. Those previous perceptions of true and yet subtle joy and happiness of letting go fade away. And at that time, there is a true and yet subtle perception of joy and happiness that comes from mental collectedness. Now, this mental collectedness is actually quite enjoyable. So when I'm saying every day to every one of you to enjoy the practice, probably at least 10 times a day, I do mean it, because this is really enjoyable. The letting go at first is enjoyable, and then afterwards it changes into this unified, collected mind, which is extremely enjoyable. And so there's no other choice but to enjoy this. Those previous perceptions of true and yet subtle joy and happiness of letting go fade away, and at that time there is a true and yet subtle perception of the joy and happiness that comes from mental collectedness. And at that time one perceives this true and subtle joy and happiness. In this way, some perceptions arise by practice, and some perceptions fade away by practice, are released. And this is that practice. Then Poṭṭhapāda, with the calming of stronger joy, abiding in mental steadiness. Now the mind starts to gain steadiness, because when it's collected, it becomes very steady. One experiences ease within one's body. When the agitation in the mind drops away because of joy, in the body too, you can feel it. It calms down. It soothes down. A state which the awakened ones describe as such. One who is present and steady in mind lives happily. Again. I see. Happy. One experiences and abides in the third level of meditation. This is the place where I say that basically the joy melts into steadiness of mind, into upekkha. And that upekkha becomes even better because it's just so light, and the mind is starting to enjoy that even more. Those previous perceptions of true and yet subtle joy and happiness of mental collectedness fade away. At that time, there is a true and yet subtle perception of the bliss of steady awareness. At that time, one perceives this true and yet subtle bliss of steady awareness. In this way, some perceptions arise by practice, and some perceptions fade away by practice. And this is that practice. Then Poṭṭhapāda, unattached to pleasant sensations, unstirred by unpleasant ones. As mental excitement and heaviness settle, with a balanced mind, which is purified by unmoving presence, one experiences and abides in the fourth level of meditation. And this is still with very light metta. At this point, the metta has lost all of its excitement. It is just gliding on the bliss of steady awareness and very light metta. And you can see now the heaviness and the states that are tied to the body also start to drop away at the fourth level. So this is where I am asking you, do you feel like there's any parts of your body missing or disappearing? This is where that is. Those previous perceptions of this true and yet subtle bliss of steady awareness fade away. And at that time there is a true but yet subtle perception beyond pleasant and unpleasant perceptions. So the mind doesn't, it's so steady and it's so balanced and it's so calm. There's no more of these extremes in the mind where, it goes all the way to like, oh, this is really enjoyable or this is really unpleasant. It's just so steady and so peaceful. And the mind starts to enjoy that a lot more, in fact. At that time, there is a true and yet subtle perception beyond pleasant and unpleasant perceptions. And at that time, one perceives this true yet subtle perception beyond pleasantness and unpleasantness. In this way, some perceptions arise by practice, some perceptions fade away by practice, and this is that practice. Then Poṭṭhapāda, going beyond all perceptions of form. Now this is Rupa Sanya, which can also be understood as the body. This is where all of the awareness of body becomes a little too coarse for the mind at this point, and this is where it's the feeling of metta feels like it moves kind of out of the body but into the mind. It moves up. Where awareness of the senses fades away, turning away from the awareness of plurality. The body is a complicated thing. I really like when she says, wow, I'm a weird looking thing. And that's pretty true. We're funny monkeys. I find. And so the mind kind of loses interest in the monkey body. Knowing there is endless space, one understands and abides in the plane of endless space. The previous perceptions of physical reality fade away. And at that time, a true but yet subtle perception of endless spaciousness. There is a true but yet subtle perception of endless spaciousness. So does that sound like her story a little bit? When she was coming out of her body and going right into that space where she was that genie out of the bottle? At that time, one perceives this true and yet subtle perception of endless spaciousness. In this way, some perceptions arise by practice and some perceptions fade away by practice. And this is that practice. And now this is the place where you don't want to try to push the feeling back down into the heart. Just leave it there, because that's where the mind delights now. It feels more liberated. It feels lighter. And that's why it goes there. It doesn't really care about the body anymore. Doesn't mean that if there's a draft of wind, you won't feel it. You will feel it. But your attention won't stay there. It will just go back up. And so when that happens, there is also perhaps some of you, I know some of you have been feeling this, a kind of a sense of also spaciousness. Because does mind have a body? No. Good answer. Body is body, mind is mind. Body and mind are two things. And even though they are interdependent, they are two different aspects. And the mind, when we leave the limits and the boundaries of the body, the mind doesn't have a body. And so the first thing that one experiences is, wow, it's so big, it's so vast, because there's no limit. There's no bodies to limit when she was kind of propping herself against the wall and see the boundaries between her body and the rest of the space? Well, this feeling of vastness is very normal, and it's the step we take into from the realm of the body into the realm of just mind. And then the mind will acquire confidence and steadiness in that space, slowly, slowly. Then Poṭṭhapāda, going entirely beyond the plane of endless space, knowing there is endless consciousness. One experiences and abides in the plane of endless consciousness. Now, this is where we start to move beyond the story that we've heard, I believe. And when the mind gets settled into the vast spaciousness with the metta, and at this point the metta won't be really possible anymore. Metta is a little bit too complicated. And it will start to detach. The feeling will start to really, really calm down and become just this very light joy, light bliss, a very calm bliss. And a lot of people actually miss this stage, so you won't necessarily know it. I've had some students, for example, that come a year and a half later and say, "Oh, I just understood. I know what it is now." And it was just a matter of just seeing it the right way, basically. Because it's so subtle. At this point, the mind is very subtle. So what happens is when the mind gets used to the spaciousness and it gets used to just being in its original space, that mind without boundaries, meditators will start to experience the activity, the active nature of consciousness. Consciousness, now this is where we start to have deeper insights on our reality. Consciousness is not a continuous, unbroken, eternal thing. It is conditioned, fabricated, crafted, and it comes up through causes and conditions, which we have built up in the past. For those who don't believe in past lives, don't worry, you don't have to. But from past lives also. Oops, I messed up my book. This is where I like to think of it as the analogy of the movie projector. So in the theaters, they have the movie projectors, and the movie projectors get this beam of light, and it's shooting through a reel of little images. And I'm being told by some of our friends in the cinema industry that actually 24 frames per second is ideal for cinema. So basically, when you go see a movie, usually it's 24 frames per second. And it's a bit the same way with consciousness. This beam of light hits each of those frames, but it's going so fast you don't even know they're frames. You don't even know they're still pictures, actually, but they're just going so fast in this motion that it creates this illusion of motion. And now we start to slow down the reel, slow down the film, basically. And sometimes people can see like a single individual images, not like an actual images, but basically a thought, just a single flashes of thoughts. That doesn't mean that you're going to see that. It's just some people see that, not everybody. Some people also understand this by having the insight, wow, mind is continually active. It's just not stopping. mind is not still. It's actually just all the time, all the time. And you might think like, wow, who wants to experience that? Sounds pretty terrible. But actually this is very subtle. This is not like really coarse. It's very subtle. So it's even more subtle than the space, the boundless space. And at this point, it's just mind is starting to rest so much more in the release that it starts to notice its activities and starts to slow it down, breaks it down. The previous perceptions of this true and yet subtle endless spaciousness fade away, and at that time there is a true and yet subtle perception of endless consciousness, and one perceives this true but yet subtle perception of endless consciousness. In this way, some perceptions arise by practice, some perceptions fade away by practice, and this is that practice. Then Poṭṭhapāda, going entirely beyond the plane of endless consciousness, knowing there is nothing, one experiences and abides in the plane of bare awareness. This is a different translation of mine where I say objectlessness. So basically, this is where what we call the still mind begins. So as you bring the Brahma Viharas to their maturity in terms of release, in terms of letting go, they get purified and they go deeper. And then the metta begins to be too coarse, too heavy, and then it fades down into this slight joy. Very, very peaceful, light joy, bliss. And you can still radiate that. And then it calms down even more into just steadiness of mind and just radiant calm, boundless calm. And the mind delight even more in that calm, more than the joy actually. So there's still that element of piti, there's still that element of finding it blissful, but it's not excited. It's just the bliss of release, basically. And at this level, the mind will start to think and feel that radiating anything is a little bit troublesome. And it will just want to be still and not move. And it will start to really enjoy just that. And so there is definitely this bliss leading the way, this bliss of release, this bliss of stillness, of not clinging to anything else. But the mind is very still, and this is where the radiation or the sending or the feeling, this boundless feeling of calm is just too much for the mind. So it just becomes very still. Like a candle without any wind, basically. There is still consciousness. Now, the movie projector, the reel has come to an end, and there's no more images. And now the beam of light is just projecting light into nothingness, into just that blank screen of the mind. Consciousness always needs an object in one way or the other, and now the object is awareness itself. But the Buddha's wisdom is so deep that this is where a lot of teachings come to an end, this bare awareness, just being attached, clinging to this awareness that is behind everything. But the Buddha saw deeper into this. He saw this awareness actually has tension in it, and that is troublesome. And to release that tension and that awareness feels even better, even more released. The previous perceptions of this true and yet subtle plane of endless consciousness fade away, and at that time there is a true and yet subtle perception of bare awareness. At that time one perceives this true and yet subtle plane of bare awareness. So now all the qualities, all of the images, any perceptions that arise, some people here are already familiar with this. Whatever your mind is trying to cling to now, you'll start to notice. There's going to be perceptions arising from out of the mind because the mind is so trained to think and cling to all these things, and now it's just emptying itself, basically. It's emptying all of the storehouse of accumulated perceptions and sensations and all of these things. And some people see lights, some people see colors, some people see some geometrical patterns, some people see lines, flashes, constriction of awareness, or some kind of halo of light. Just release, relax. Don't get involved. Don't put your awareness on this. Actually, learn to let it go. Learn to release your awareness even from these perceptions. Here what we are starting to do is to move away from all objects of the mind. There are no objects beyond this point. Or slowly dissolving the objects. In this way, some perceptions arise by practice and some perceptions fade away by practice, and this is that practice. Now here there's a place, there's a stage in this particular sutta that is skipped, neither perception nor non-perception. And that state, this is why I kind of call it an in-between state. It's not a very clear place. It's like the marsh of mental liberation, where the thing is, when you start to release awareness itself, like the movie projector, there's no more awareness. So how can you be aware that there's no more awareness? So this is that muddy waters where the mind feels so much better without awareness, but then it doesn't know necessarily when it gets to that place. So I used to, do we have time? I have a little story, an analogy from my canoeing background. So I used to do really long canoe expeditions up northern Quebec, and we would go for 30 plus days, like 33 days, in full autonomy. We would take the train up, completely up Quebec, northern Quebec, and drop off our canoes, and we would spend like 2-3 weeks dehydrating food for the whole expedition, and so we would get dropped off the train in the middle of absolutely nowhere, where there's like nobody, and just pristine landscapes, and start paddling that lake. And so when we do these expeditions, this was, well, there's a few, but the one I started realizing this phenomena was we were paddling, it was a 750 kilometers stretch of river. And to get to the river, we had to paddle up another river and to basically cross what we call the drainage divide, which is basically the way that geology works and the way that hydrography works is that everywhere you have mountains, valleys, gullies, and ridges. And this is what kind of welcomes or takes the water, the rainwater, and makes it trickle into creeks and into rivers and into basically estuaries, or it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and then it moves back into the ocean. And these are all delimited. Basically, these are called drainage divides. And so on one side of the ridge, water flows one way. And on the other side of the ridge, water flows the other way. So on our canoe expedition, we would paddle upstream for quite a while, for maybe 10 days. And that was quite strenuous because the river is big, and there's a lot of current running through it, and you just like paddling hard and looking at the shore, and you're not really moving very fast, but you're moving anyways, nonetheless. And then it would get smaller, and then we would branch off into another stream to kind of make our way to the right place we wanted to cross over. And then the river kind of gets narrower, shallower, and we take off another branch, and then we get to a place where basically we're just trying to haul our canoes in the stream. It's quite useful because at least we don't have to carry all of our food and all of that, which is really heavy, and we can just haul our canoes through. But at some point it just stops, and it just becomes this marsh where there's not enough water to haul your canoe, but there's a little bit of water still, and you have to walk through that. And this is kind of how I like to think of this state where all of that time we've been releasing consciousness, awareness, purified it until it's just a small trickle, and then it kind of seems like it disappears, and then it reappears at some point, and then you have to you haul your canoe on the ground, or you portage, and then you cross over this kind of like dry bank where there's like a spine, basically. This is like dry ground for a little bit. Doesn't last very long. And now there's no more water, it's dry. And at that time, when you continue walking the other direction, you kind of have to use your compass because you don't really know which way it's flowing, so you have to aim at the right place. Then you start noticing little streams that start to form again. And this marsh that started on the other side too, then it starts to agglomerate and makes these little streams. And what I would do, I would like rip some pieces of grass and throw them in the stream so that I would know which way it was going. And at this point, this is a little bit what happens with consciousness. So you get to this place where you can't actually tell if there's consciousness or not. It's like a mix of there's no more awareness, but then it's like patchy. There's a little puddle here and a little puddle there, and then sometimes it's marshy, and it's kind of in between. Bhante would call it like, it's like being aware but being asleep at the same time. But mindfulness is sharp, so it's not dull, it's not sleepy. It's really a conscious release of awareness itself. And then at some point there's a dry bank where there's definitely no more consciousness. There is no more experience, there is no more perception of anything, there is no more consciousness. One cannot be aware of this. It's impossible because there's no more anything that can be aware of. So that's why I like to say nobody actually attains Nibbāna because you can't know because there's no more awareness to witness. That's just a beautiful teaching on pride and attainments. And so really when we're fully devoted to this, we understand that this process is about emptying the bucket, you know. It's not about filling it up with pride and like, oh, I'm this or that, and I'm a stream enterer, or like I'm an anagami, or whatever it happens to be. When you get there, it's about the bliss of release, and that's what is actually interesting in that experience. But then after that, then awareness starts to come back again, and it's patchy, and it can't really tell. And then at some point there will be enough water to tell that it's actually, oh, the stream is kind of coming back online. And usually, when this is experienced truly, deeply, and the mind really goes down, in neither perception and non-perception, it's like this in-between state, where it's kind of marshy, it's hard to tell. But at some point it goes in, it goes down, and it cuts away. And it won't last very long. So it's just like this little, tiny, short experience. But you know that mind has completely dropped out. It's completely gone for at least a second or two. And when consciousness comes back live again, it is able to see that for a moment it was gone. That it is able to see. And the Buddha actually backs this up in suttas, where he says, neither perception or non-perception, and Nirodha, the full release of mind, these states, one can only be aware of them when one comes out of them. So paccavekkhana, one reflects, looks back upon what happened there, and then if that happened to you, just continue releasing, relaxing any perceptions that arise out of this, any thoughts and perceptions, ideas. And you might feel like you have great relief coming in, like you've let go of a heavy burden. Relax, calm down, enjoy, and do it over again. And repeat the process and enjoy even deeper. And so the other thing that happens is that we feel like we're working hard to get there. We're kind of like paddling upstream for a long time, and then at some point we get there, and it's basically effortless at that point, because we're not paddling anymore, but we're reconditioning, rewiring the mind completely to let go all the time. It's like the let go operating system, the let go OS, the not iOS. And so when that operating system is installed, then release is kind of automatic, basically, or it's really easy to tap into that automatic release. And the water basically starts flowing the other way, slowly. Of course, there's still work to be done. There's still the 6 R's. There's still discerning things, but mind will slant, slope, and incline toward viveka, towards release. And more, that's just all it will want to do. Sit in meditation and enjoy the bliss of freedom. And this is what you're doing on this retreat. So I'll just wrap it up. Up to here, Poṭṭhapāda. And this is one of the best description of how to enter Nirodha Samāpatti / Nibbāna. One is conscious, up to here, one is conscious of oneself. And gradually, one stage after the other, one arrives at the finest level of perception. Once in that finest stage of perception, one understands thus: mental activities are worse for me. Freedom from mental activities would be better. If I were to incline or engage my mind in any way, these fine meditative perceptions would cease and gross perceptions would arise. Therefore, one does not incline nor engages one's mind in any way. Uninclined and disengaged, those perceptions fade away, and gross perceptions do not arise. One contacts Nirodha. One contacts release. This is how Poṭṭhapāda, the complete release from perceptual awareness, is gradually understood and experienced. And I will just finish with the last bit of this sutta. It is for the purpose of abandoning the three kinds of selves that I teach the Dhamma in this way, Poṭṭhapāda. For those who practice in this way, mental impurities come to be given up, and clear mental states directly come to growth, and they know the maturity and full development of discernment here and now. Having realized it by their own direct experience, they abide in it. It is possible that you might think, Poṭṭhapāda, when mental impurities come to be given up and clear mental states directly come to growth, that is no happy state to live in. But that is not so, Poṭṭhapāda. This is how it should be seen. When mental impurities come to be given up and clear mental states directly come to growth, and one knows the maturity and full development of discernment here and now, having understood by one's direct experience, attaining it and remaining in it, much relief and gladness are experienced, joy, calm, presence of mind, and full awareness, and one abides in happiness. So this is the purpose of our practice. Yeah. Yes. So basically this is the map. This is the map of release, and this is the map of meditation. If we do that, and if we're very devoted to this, then all the defilements, all the impurities of the mind starts to break apart and break down and be washed away. And we start to see reality like this, just the seen as the seen, the cognized as the cognized, the perceived as the perceived. We don't label, we don't put our opinions and preferences, ideas, judgments about the experience. We just live completely at peace with whatever is. But we can't just say that and feel that. It's a mental training, because we're hardwired to feel the opposite. Like it's proven, we have a negativity bias. So we have to overcome this, and this is what we're doing here. And personally, I find too much emphasis on anicca, dukkha, anatta, impermanence, suffering, and not self to be too heavy for the mind. If we just look at these things all the time, this is basically the long, painful path the Buddha described. It can lead to the awakening, but it's long and painful, because we're training our minds to see dukkha all the time, and it's not really pleasant. Whereas with the jhanas, we're practicing samatha vipassana, yoked together. So the samatha helps us see with clarity. Like as I said, each of the levels of meditation is more blissful than the other. So that means we're seeing the other as dukkha. It's just a sneaky way to talk about it, but it's still there. It's still the same thing. We're still seeing anicca, because that state, these perceptions arose and then these perceptions passed away. This is anicca. Then dukkha It arose and passed away because we saw it with wisdom. We saw that the previous state was heavier. And then the next stage is lighter, is more released, it's more pleasant. So we release from that. And the Buddha in so many ways praised and taught and explained how to do this and how to meditate in that way. And anatta, well, it just basically, I've given a few teachings on this, but this samadhi itself is anatta, and anatta is samadhi. There's very little idea of a self when somebody is in this kind of released awareness samadhi. It can be. If a self arises in either perception and non-perception, well, you're back down again. You have to release the self. It's not even a question. Neither perception and non-perception, or bare awareness or nothingness. This is the last bastion of me. Because the last object of clinging that we cling to as me, as I, as myself, as I-ness, me-ness, is consciousness itself. And when that breaks away, when that gets dissolved, then we see, there is no self. So the teaching is there, and it's very obvious. And this is the direct way to experience this in the fastest and most relevant way for us. Because I practiced these other practices which emphasized seeing dukkha all the time, seeing anicca all the time. It's in line, but it's nowhere near the depth of this insight that one can get where the release of awareness completely occurs. And like you said, when it's also possible to experience glimpses of this while you're walking. There are some people who do. Although I wouldn't actually put too much emphasis on this because the path is the same. So if you cultivate your mind and to understand each of the level of meditation, which are levels of insight into the mind, the jhanas, personally, I think the jhana, the word jhana, the root of the word jhana, actually means D, is to illuminate, yes, this clarity of mind. This is used in the Gayatri mantra when the Vedic, when the Brahmin priests on the side of the Ganga river in India, they salute the sun, the rising sun, and there's they use that word dhimai, like we meditate upon the sun so that it may enlighten our minds, and is the same root in D in jhana, which actually is closer to seeing than any kind of other word like absorption or anything. So these states of jhanas, they are levels of insight into the mind. And that's another thing I really liked about Bhante Vimaramsi. He called them the levels of understanding into your mind, basically. And the way that we understand is by noticing that the previous state is heavy, tensed a little bit more. And then we move out of this and to a deeper release. And that's wisdom. Okay, good. Very good. And so, what to do with this tonight? What's the purpose of this talk is to give you the map. You do right effort when you do the 6 hours with the Brahma Viharas, which is what you've been doing. The mind will go through these landmarks, which are called the jhanas, the levels of meditation. And to know the map is just really useful, because then when you get to a certain place and a certain experience happens to you, like the feeling goes up into the head, And then if you don't know that you're not supposed to bring it back down and to really try to make the metta stronger, where actually it's supposed to become calmer, it's actually where we want it to be. And it's useful, it gives us the direction, the right direction, and we can continue practicing properly. On this retreat, we have a very specific curriculum, so I try to nudge everybody on that road. And when you go back home, you can do whatever you want. You can explore these stages more if you like. Here, I'm just trying to help you show and see the whole, as far as you can go in the road. And then when you go back, you can, if you like to spend more time feeling or understanding a particular state or playing with something like sending your love to the universe or to specific people or to try to understand the jhanas better. We don't put a lot of emphasis on jhanas on these retreats, like knowing exactly where you are, because this takes time and it takes a lot of practice, and you don't actually need to know that. You don't really need to know that much. There's only a few things that is good to know for your progress through this, and then afterwards you can look deeper. That will actually help you make a lot of progress. When we stop and look at every little pebble on the road, we don't make a whole lot of mileage. So, but when you do the road all the time afterwards, then you'll start to know the landscape quite well. Okay, you've been very patient. Well done. Okay, so let's share our merits and then be on our merry ways. May suffering ones be suffering free, and the fear-struck fearless be. May the grieving shed all grief, and may all beings find relief. May all beings share these merits that we have thus acquired for the acquisition of all kinds of happiness. May beings inhabiting space and earth, devas and nagas of mighty powers, share these merits of ours. May they long protect the Buddha's dispensation. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
I'm leaving home for the coastline, someplace under the sun. I feel my heart for the first time, 'cause now I'm moving on, yeah.